Alright, next up on the Ultracruiser, we're going to be working on the control stick assembly that bolts in here on the front of the spar carry-through. I think I finally have enough parts to get it done. Here's the parts that are needed. I've got these two hinge pieces that I built the other day. This long section of 3/4 inch tube will be both what they call the torque tube and the control stick itself. We'll cut it in pieces. This pipe that we're using for the stick and the torque tube section will slide through these hinges so it can move. The hinges are bolted onto the spar carry through. This section here slides on the torque tube and it'll have ears coming off of it that will weld onto this, and they go to the elevator control. And it will eventually slide onto the end of this piece. Be about that long, have the ears come out, and then when we get everything set, we will drill and rivet that to hold it in place. That way it rotates those two ears. Then we need a sheet of 1/8 inch 60/61 to make the connectors that go onto the ends of the torque tube and the stick. And then this over here is a piece of 1/4 inch or 5/16 inch stock, I believe it is. One or the other. It was supposed to be tubing, couldn't find any tubing the right size, so this gets welded into the stick as a cross support, and then I'll just put it in the lathe and drill a 3/16 hole through the middle of it. Now we can start cutting stuff to length. All right, I got the parts rough cut out for the torque tube assembly. These two pieces will sandwich on each side of that and get welded on. And then the control stick will come down through here, and that will pivot this whole assembly like this, and then the control stick can still move side to side for aileron control. So I'll fire up the welder and get this fastened together. Once it's fastened together, I'll measure out and drill a hole. Figured I'd do it after welding to make sure the hole goes straight through both pieces, everything's lined up properly. Make sure nothing gets distorted a little bit while I'm welding. Okay, what I've done so far is I've welded on the one side. I was going to try to clamp them both together and weld both, but it was hard to keep them straight. You know, clamping these flat pieces onto a round tube. So what I did is just welded one side on. And then since I've got a couple of these to do, I turned a little spacer that's 3/4 inches long like this is, and I'm going to put it in between and run a bolt to it. And then once that's fastened, I can go ahead and weld this other side, and everything should be nice and straight. And there it is, clamped together, so everything is nice and straight. We'll weld both of these sides around the ends. Then once it cools off, we can take it to the belt sander, round these ends off. And I've drilled that out to 3/16. We'll need to take it on out to 5/16 because there's bushings that go in each side of this, because the stick will be going down through the middle and it needs to pivot. Using that spacer to keep everything aligned worked out really well. It's all welded. One little issue, which if you've watched any of my videos, it's not unusual to have an issue. When you look at the welding diagram of this, it says weld all around. So I welded all around. But then I looked at the assembly picture, and what centers this up is this bushing being up against the end of this. And really in the picture, it shows it being right up against the flat on the back of that. So welding around the end was probably not the best idea. The other arm goes on like this, and it butts up against that piece that holds the elevator control. So you really want this, you know, a little bit wider most likely, and you have to watch out for the holes in the spar carry through. So what I think I'll do is put this in the lathe and trim that weld back to the diameter of the tubing and make a nice flat surface for the bushing to ride against. If you don't have a lathe, or if you're having somebody else weld this, you might want to tell them not to weld the ends. Easy fix, but just I should have looked ahead on the plans further. The torque tube is pretty much done. I put the bushings in it, I rounded off the edges, cleaned it up a little bit. This machining that down, the weld worked really well, because now you have a nice squared off edge to hold that in place. So that's not, and it's still welded underneath. And what this does is your stick goes in like this, and it can move like this to move your elevator, and then back and forth like this to run your ailerons. So next up, I have to weld a couple of pieces on the bottom of this to hook to the rod ends to go to the ailerons. And then there'll be a hole up here somewhere with an insert welded into it where this pivots. So back to cutting out a couple more parts and back to welding. Okay, here is the welded end of the control stick. And I gotta say, making that little spacer makes that a lot easier to weld, because once you've got the one hole in, you put that together, keeps everything lined up just perfect. So now I'm going to clean all this up, and then we'll drill the pivot hole and weld in to hook this into the torque tube. Okay, the end is shined up. This piece here is that piece of bar stock I had. I cut a section off, drilled a hole through the center for the bolt. It needs to be welded on both ends. Slide that down, leave a little hanging out so I can use the burn back and fuse it together, and I'll cut this end off. Basically, by the time you're done, it needs to be the width of the tube, but have that insert welded in there. And there is that hole. Welded up both sides, put it in the lathe, turned it back down, smoothed it out. So that is ready to have the torque tube bolted on like this. So here's what we've got so far. Control stick, these will be mounted onto the spar carry through. Stick and move forward and aft, pivoting this, the piece that we'll be making here in a second, to run the elevator. This piece will move like this. A couple of rod ends go in here, and they will go out each direction to run the ailerons. Now for the elevator torque arms, we need to make two of these little jobs out of that 1/8 inch 6061. My plan is to just get the holes drilled in a rough chunk of it and then weld it on, then we'll shape it later. There are the two pieces that will end up being the elevator control lever. They will be welded onto this tube side by side, and I went ahead and made a spacer the width that it's supposed to be so we can stack it up and bolt it together again like we did before. That worked out really well. So what I'm going to do is weld the bottom one on and then stack them, and then weld the top on, and then we'll do a little cutting and shaping to where they're the right design, and that should be done. Okay, that side is welded. It's welded on the other side on the interior. And this piece I have put the spacer in, bolted it in place, so I'll run a bead around here, and that'll have all the welding done. I'll probably have to come in, smooth out a spot there for the cross bolt, since I'm making the weld a little bit wide, and then we will trim down the edges. Alright, that's the final weld on this piece. And this wide flange here that sticks up will end up being bolted to the torque tube. So I'm going to come in with an end mill and clearance a couple of spots, one on each side for the bolt head. I think they also use a rivet, so I'll clear this little spot for a rivet. And then, like I said, we can shape it. And here we are with the finished assembly. There's your elevator crank, the mounts, aileron. Now all we got to do is center it up on the spar carry through, drill and bolt it in place. And there we go. We got a control stick. Side to side, forward and back. Everything looks good. The elevator piece will pin in place during final assembly. So for now, that's about all I can do. Tomorrow, we build a rib. After getting done with everything yesterday, I slept on it and was thinking about this elevator drive. I was not happy with it, as this was the first one I built. The pipe inside is what the factory calls for in the plans, but it just didn't give me enough room to put the bolt in. I think I should have made this side a little closer to flush. I left enough hanging out to where I could make a good weld. But besides the bolt, it also, when it lines up with the hole in the when it lines up with the hole in the spar carry through, didn't look like it was over far enough. So I went ahead and welded up another one. No big deal. I left this one with an extra long piece here. And when it's on, it's more in the center of the hole in the spar carry through. And I'll just cut this down when I go to build the linkage and make it exactly what it needs to be to fit through that hole perfectly. But I've been enjoying welding here lately, and it was not a big deal to build another piece. And here's what it looks like with the new one in there. As you can see, it looks like it'll have to be cut back some, but that's easy to do. And then we'll be able to drill the hole. Other than that, it all looks and works good. Now, I was planning on building a rib today, but after rebuilding this piece, on the fact that it's 60 degrees in February, son and I are going for a motorcycle ride. So thanks for watching. Maybe we'll build a rib tomorrow.